Hello everyone, today we are doing 11.6, factoring x squared plus bx plus c. If you notice that has three terms, so that is a trinomial. The things we need to be able to master is just one thing, factor trinomials using the guess and check method. So that is what we are doing today. So first of all, there are three things about these polynomials that we're going to be factoring. The first is that they have a degree of 2. So remember, to find the degree of a polynomial, we look at each of the terms individually and ask ourselves, what's the degree of each term? And then whichever has the highest degree, the polynomial takes that degree. So we see the x squared has the highest degree here, so that means this has a degree of 2. And that actually has a special name. It is called a quadratic. So that's the first thing. We're looking at polynomials that have a degree of 2. And we are looking at polynomials that have 3 terms. Now, do you remember what that is called? I actually mentioned it just a second ago. That is called a trinomial. And lastly, today we are going to be looking at polynomials that have a leading coefficient of 1. Now, this is not always going to be the case. We can have polynomials where the number in front of the x squared is not 1, but today we're only going to look at the cases where that number is 1. Usually we put an a there, so that is a equals 1. So again, we have a 1 in front of the x squared. That's the leading coefficient. So those are the three things that are going to be true about all of our polynomials we're looking at today. Now first we want to recall just how do we work these out. What do I do when I have two binomials that I'm multiplying together? Well, that's something that we just learned recently, and that is that we distribute. So we usually start by distributing the x to both terms, and then we go here and we distribute the 3 to both terms. Remember this? So x times x gives me x squared. X times 2 gives me a positive 2x. Now I distribute that 3. 3 times x gives me 3x, and 3 times 2 gives me 6. So I have now distributed all of my terms because I'm trying to simplify this. So I distributed the x and distributed the 3. Now I need to combine my like terms. I have a 2x and a 3x, so when I add those together, I get x squared plus 5x plus 6. So hopefully we all know how to do that because we've been working on that the past few lessons. On this next one, I want us to approach it slightly differently. We're still going to distribute, but we are just going to do it a little bit differently. We're going to use kind of a graphic organizer of sorts. A graphic organizer just means there's a specific way that we organize our terms, that we organize what we do to make it easier. So the way that I'm going to do it is I'm going to start by multiplying the x times the x, just like we did last time. So let's write down that gives us x squared. But now instead of multiplying the x by the 1 at the top, I'm going to bring it down at the bottom here. And you'll see the reason we're doing that. It's just this is the way that we're going to organize it this way, and it's going to help us as we factor. So I'm going to go ahead and draw my line from the x to the 1, and x times 1 gives me 1x. So I'm not going to write it down here yet. I'm only going to write my final answer at the bottom. Now I'm going to multiply the negative 2 times the x. Negative 2 times x gives me a negative 2x. And then I'm going to multiply my constant. So then I multiply the negative 2 times the 1, and that gives me a negative 2 at the end. Now let's combine our like terms. Here are the like terms. We have a negative 2x and a positive 1x, and that gives us negative 1x. Or you can just write x squared minus x minus 2. You don't have to write the 1 there. So either way, that is what we get. Now the reason we're doing this is because having these together down here is just going to help us as we are factoring and checking our work, because it's so important to check our work. So this kind of looks like a little monkey to me. Just hang with me here. If you put the eyes there, there's the nose and there's the mouth. So I'm going to refer to Curious George, or call him just George. George the monkey is our graphic organizer, the way that we are going to multiply binomials. Now for factoring today, we are going to be given a trinomial like this, and we're going to go backwards. So today we're going to figure out how do I take this and get back to those factors, get back to those binomials. That's what we're doing today. But before we do that, I just want us to use the Curious George method on this one, our graphic organizer, real quick. So the first thing we do is we take that x times the x, and that gives us x squared. Now we take the x times the negative 3 down below, and we have x times negative 3 is negative 3x. And then also down below we take that negative 4 times the x, and that gives us negative 4x. So again, we're using our graphic organizer here to distribute this first binomial. And lastly, I take that negative 4 times the negative 3. I have a negative 4 times negative 3 gives me positive 12. So I can go ahead and write that at the end. Then I just need to combine my like terms. So I have a negative 4x minus 3x gives me negative 7x. So x squared minus 7x plus 12 is the trinomial that we get when we multiply these two binomials. And again, today we are going to be going from here back to there. We're going backwards today. So before we actually start factoring, we need to know how to do it. So we've got a series of steps here that we're going to go through, and then we will go through some examples on the back of the notes together. So first of all, the first thing we always look for when we're factoring is a GCF. So that was what 11.5 was. It's so important that we always check for a GCF, and that is the head of our robot. So that's the head of the factoring robot. Remember, that was handed out in class today. The head of our robot is GCF, so that's what we always do first, and then we place it on the outside. So after we find the GCF, then we're going to draw our parentheses. So we've got a GCF sometimes, and then we are going to have two sets of parentheses. These parentheses are our factors. So let's look up here for a second. We started with two sets of parentheses, two binomials that we multiplied, and we ended with a trinomial. Well, now we are going backwards. So now we are starting with a trinomial that looks like x squared plus bx plus c. We're starting with that, so that means we're ending with our two binomial factors. Now the first thing we put in our factors is the variable. Well, the first thing we're starting with is x squared. So let's think about that. X squared can also be written as x times x. So the first thing we always put whenever we are working with a trinomial of this kind, where we just have an x squared at the front, no leading coefficient, we start with our variables x and x. Step 3 is to think about what our signs will be. So we start by looking at what signs do we already have. And to do that, we always start by looking at the second sign. So start by looking at the second sign. The second sign is whatever's in front of that c. So we see in both of these cases, we have a positive c. We are adding c in both of these trinomials. So whenever that's the case, if I have a trinomial and my second sign is a plus, that means the sign of my factors are going to be the same. So I'm going to have the same signs in my factors. That means I'll either have two positives or two negatives. Let's go up to the top and look at why that is. Whenever we have the same signs here, when we have a positive and a positive, when we multiply that 3 by the 2, we get a positive 6. And then in this example, we have a negative and a negative, same signs. When we multiply the negative times the negative, we end up with a positive. So whenever the signs are the same in our factors, that means that we end with a positive c. Then after we look at the second sign to determine whether we have the same signs or different signs, we go back and look at the first sign. So go back and look at the first sign. If we have a positive c, and then we go back and we look and we have a positive in front of the bx, that means that both of our signs are going to be positive. So we'll have x plus something times x plus something. If we have a positive c, so we look and our second sign is positive, then we go back and we have a negative, that means we are going to have x minus something times x minus something. So this is very important. After we break apart in the two parentheses and we have x and x, we have to look at our signs. So if they are a positive in front of the c, that means they're both going to be the same. So either two pluses or two minuses. Now, if they are a negative in front of the c, so if I have a negative sign in front of the c, that means that our signs are going to be different in our factors. So that means we have different signs. Again, we start by looking at the second sign, and then we go to the first sign. Start at the second, go to the first. So what if we have a second sign that is negative? Well, that means we're going to have x plus something and x minus something, because we have different signs. But now this negative sign tells us that the bigger number is going to be negative. So go ahead and write that. The bigger number is going to be negative. And if that doesn't really make sense now, that's okay. I'll explain it more on the back, but just let's write this all down. Now if we have a negative c, if our second sign is negative and our first sign is positive, that means again we're going to have x plus something and x minus something, but our bigger number is going to be positive. So just to recap, if we look at the trinomial we're given, we always look at the second sign first. If it's positive, then that means we either have plus plus or minus minus. If it's negative, like these, it means we have plus minus either way. And again, we'll look more at that on the back of the notes. Now the next thing we do is find the factors that will work, and we use guess and check. So that means we don't have a fancy method for this. We just have to see what are the factors and then try them out and see which one works. So if we have 1x squared plus bx plus c, we have our trinomial here. Let's think about the puzzles that we did in class. Remember where we multiplied to get whatever was on the top and we added to get whatever was on the bottom. Well, in this case, we multiply to get c and we add to get b. So there's our c and there is our b. One way to think about this is the ceiling is at the top of a room. So the ceiling is going to be at the top of our little x. And then the basement is in the bottom of a house. So the basement is going to be at the bottom. So we have to multiply to get c and add to get b. And whatever those two numbers are, whatever two numbers we get here, we put into our factors. So we have to figure out what we multiply to get c and add to get b, and then the last thing we do is check our work by distributing. So what we're going to use is George. That's why we have Curious George here. We have our two parentheses. We know we'll usually have an x and an x. Sometimes we'll have a GCF out front. We start by multiplying that out. Then we multiply the x times that constant, this constant times x, and the constants together, and we end up with George. So the reason we multiply it back out is just to check our work, because if we get the wrong factors here and we multiply it out, then we'll see that we did it wrong. So that's something that's very important as well, is being able to check back over our work. So now you've got one or two questions to answer real quick and then come back to the next video.